Hi, I'm Chris Wolfe of the Thomas International Center, and we're continuing with our course, our short course on the Declaration of Independence and the purposes of American government. What I'd like to do now, pretty much concluding that section, is talk about the transition from the Declaration to the Constitution. The Declaration, I've argued, lays out the purposes of American government, what it was that we thought government should accomplish. And in doing so, it provided a kind of goal, an ideal, that the founders would keep in mind as they tried to establish a government. And so I want to look a little bit at the transition from the Declaration to the Constitution. Now, recalling our earlier discussion, the Declaration does not demand democracy, representative democracy, or republicanism. Madison described republicanism as representative democracy in one of the Federalist Papers. Was there really a question about whether or not American government would choose to go in some other direction than republicanism? Well, the Declaration, as we argued, may not literally demand republican government. It may be that some countries, under some circumstances, might choose some other non-republican government, although never a government that, in a kind of consistent way violated natural human rights. But in the case of America, there was never any question that we would be a republican form of government. And we saw that especially in the second half of the Declaration, when the founders moved from the self-evident principles of government, which tended to be universal, to applying the question, have our rights been sufficiently violated that we should assert our natural right to alter or abolish the form of government? As we were confronting that question, we were asking, has the King of England really, in a way, lived up to his responsibilities? If there's a certain kind of agreement between us, a covenant or a contract, has the king really kept his side of the bargain? And the second half, well, more than second half, the roughly 2/3 of the Declaration is this very long and detailed list of grievances that the colonists, the former colonists, have against the King of England. And it involves all kinds of principles that look pretty Republican, talking about legislatures and talking about taxation without consent. So looking at the second half of the Declaration, we can see that the founders were assuming that Americans were going to have republican government. Now, it wasn't just an abstract or a theoretical assumption. The fact of the matter was that the very physical circumstances of the colonies had already led them to be self-governing, largely republican, for many years before. What were the circumstances of the people who settled this new continent? They'd come over from the mother country, largely from England, but from other places as well. They came into this wilderness, and they were creating a new society here, and doing so pretty much on their own. Given the conditions of transportation and communication at that time, there was some communication between the mother country and the colonies, but it was quite limited. These new settlers pretty much had to carve out new governments, townships, settlements in the new country without much support or guidance from England. So the result is that from the very beginning, they were already, in many important respects, self-governing. This was encouraged by the religion of the especially the settlers of New England, because there you had people who are largely Congregationalists. That is the term that we came to use for the Puritans, the Pilgrims. And these were religions that involved a fair amount of control in the congregation itself, as opposed to some distant hierarchy. So the result is that there was a certain almost republican quality to the kind of religion that the New England settlers had. Just for historical reasons, as Tocqueville notes, the conditions of Americans from the very beginning encouraged a great deal of self-government. And this took the form especially of townships and town meetings, where you were dealing with such small territory that you could actually have a government where pretty much all the citizens got together and discussed, what should be done and, what the projects would be for the common good there. And so that republicanism was kind of almost built in to Americans' political DNA, you might say. So that's, one factor. And then, of course, the colonists had increasingly come to embrace Republican ideas in the run-up to the Revolutionary War, to the Declaration of Independence itself. More and more, the founders were sensitive to what they perceived as violations of their rights, their liberties, their freedoms as Englishmen from the mother country and the representatives that, for instance, the royal governors that were set over or other royal officials. And so the spirit of republicanism had been building up to the Declaration and the Revolution. So by the time the Revolutionary War is fought, there's not a real question, should we have republicanism or not? It was already determined, and in fact, it was widely felt that this was part of what you might call the genius of American government. That is, those particular qualities that are somehow integral to the identity of a particular group. Madison uses this term in Federalist Number 39, that republicanism is part of the genius of the American people. So, result is the framers of the Constitution, or the framers of early American government, starting with the Articles and then the Constitution, did not have to wonder about whether or not the overall form of government would be Republican. It was going to be Republican, but that leaves us with a question. What did they have to decide then? They had to decide on the form of republicanism. And this is not a minor or insignificant question, a matter of minor details. The form of republicanism can be quite different. And for the founders, the question of how to construct a Republican form of government was a serious one and not necessarily an easy one. Why not? Well, when the founders looked to history, ancient history and modern history, there was not a lot that was very encouraging with respect to Republican government. As they look back on the classical world, the ancient world, there had been republics in Greece, Athens being a good example of a democracy. And there were sometimes leagues of city-states as well that had republican elements to them. But when they look back on that history, what did the founders see? The founders generally saw something that didn't look very attractive. One way that these ancient republics were characterized was as nurseries of unceasing discord, wretched nurseries of unceasing discord. That is, what happened in these ancient forms of government? Liberty was emphasized quite a bit in them, and so what you'd have is the society breaking up into a lot of self-interested parties. And then one party would get in control and sometimes become dominant for a while, even perhaps to the point of moving from free government to autocracy. it would be overthrown and a new government would be put in its place, but then it might eventually evolve into an autocracy as well. So you had this constant alteration of oppression and then revolution and establishment of free government, and then that evolving into unfree government. And it didn't look as if republicanism was generally able to provide stable government. The very freedom that's involved in republicanism or in democracy made it easy to have this constant turmoil, this turning over of government from one form to another. And so the ancient world was not encouraging. What about the modern world? As the framers looked around the world, what did they say in the way of republics? Well, the best modern examples of republics were Switzerland and Holland. I mean, these are two relatively small governments, often caught in between the bigger major powers of the time. Well, who would aspire to having that form of government? I mean, in Switzerland, even to maintain itself, was really possible largely because it was very small and in very mountainous territory, and not something that was so essential for the major powers to take, so that helped to protect its freedom. Holland is often actually involved in these battles between the major powers of the time, and that was reflected sometimes in there becoming a ping pong ball between the major powers. So the result is, who would want to aspire to be, Switzerland or Holland in the modern world? That these larger countries could dominate. So, if you were just looking at historical precedent, the framers would have had good reason to have doubts about whether republicanism was really practicable, whether it was an ideal that could be achieved, whether in fact it was an ideal. Well, the founders ultimately chose republicanism partly because they thought it was not just a theoretical ideal, but because they thought modern politics had invented new ways of improving republican government. That is, there was what was called a new science of politics that made it possible for republican government to be successful in a way that it had not historically been successful. Now, when the founders were dealing with this new science of politics, which is really what we're going to be describing as we look at the various principles of the Constitution, they had in mind certain typical problems that republics faced and that had to be dealt with. And the problems were at either of two extremes. One extreme was that republics could become so strong that they could endanger freedom. And the core notion here was the idea of tyranny of the majority. The government of the republic might be quite strong, but being strong, it might be too strong, right? Because Republicans generally are going to operate according to majority rule, so you get some majority of society getting control of government. And at that point, there might be relatively few obstacles in their way to achieving whatever it is that they'd want to accomplish. But what if some of the things they wanted to accomplish involved depriving minorities of their liberties? What would protect the rights of minorities in a form of government based on majority rule? So this is one danger of republics, that even though that they're established with a view to freedom, since they operate on majority rule, it might end up being the freedom of the majority, but without the freedom of the minority. This was not just a theoretical concern for the founders. They thought they had actually seen this kind of problem raising its head in the period after the Declaration of Independence. in the period of the early state governments before the formation of the Constitution. There were some state governments in which the legislature pretty much took all power to itself and in some cases ran roughshod over the rights of minorities. And the framers were concerned that the kind of government they were establishing not be subject to the same danger, that there had to be some kind of built-in mechanisms that would prevent this kind of tyranny of the majority. So that's one problem. On one side, you got the problem of government being too strong and endangering the liberty it was established to achieve. On the other hand, there was also the problem of government being too weak. Remember, government and liberty are not related simply by saying, well, if you keep government power limited, you're going to have liberty, because government plays an important role in protecting liberty. Liberty is threatened by government, but it's also liberty can be endangered by non-governmental factors as well. It can be endangered by the power of private parties. In fact, if you look at a situation of anarchy, who is more likely to be able to take care of themselves? You know, is it the rich and the powerful, or the poor and the weak? You know, so government is an essential mechanism for protecting liberty, even though sometimes it can also be a threat to liberty. Republicans generally tend to be very sensitive to the danger of government being too strong, government endangering liberty, especially when you consider that republicanism is often a reaction against monarchy or the abuses of monarchies or aristocracies, where there's a concentration of power and unequal power that results in oppression of many of the people. You know, republics are a kind of reaction against that. So as they react against it, the temptation might be to make the government quite weak so that it wouldn't be a threat to the liberties of the people. But of course, if you make government too weak, then it can't really enforce the rights of the people that are protected by law. And again, the founders thought that they had seen this, especially in the Articles of Confederation at the national level, where they thought that government had been made too weak and therefore was unable to accomplish some of the purposes it was supposed to accomplish. And we'll be taking a look at the Articles of Confederation and see what the critique of that was. So here we are with the founders, you know, wanting to pursue republicanism. It's not a question what form of government they're going to pursue. It's going to be Republican. But the question is, how do they construct the Republican government? It's got to be a government that's not going to be too strong for the liberties of the people and not too weak so that it can't protect the liberties of the people. This question is formulated at the beginning of Federalist number 51 by Madison, who says that you have to get a government that is capable of controlling the people, that is, of making sure that rights are respected. On the other hand, it also has to be a kind of government that's capable of controlling itself as well, of being controlled, so that it itself doesn't become a threat to the people's liberties. This is the problem that the founders of American government were confronting. And the answer they give to that is going to come in a couple of stages. You know, first of all, there's going to be an experiment, which is the Articles of Confederation. This is the first attempt to establish a national government. Although I should also add, not forget, the fact that really the first constitutions, the first republics in America, were the different state constitutions, which were established in the wake of the Declaration. Not all the states adopted new constitutions, but most of them did. In fact, Adams wrote a famous work that was really an analysis and to some extent a critique of the new state governments. So the first efforts are the state governments, and then together with the Articles of Confederation. And then, of course, eventually, after not too long a time, there was a sense that this first experiment had not been successful, and it would be necessary to establish a new government that would more effectively achieve the kind of republicanism that the founders aspired to. And so we'll turn to that in our next class. Thank you.